I'm Margot Gutierrez. I'm excited to find where the stranded energy is today. That's what we're going to be talking about. Really excited to kind of piggyback on the great conversation we had our previous panel work on last session. Our panelists are experts in the field of stranded energy, so I'm excited to present Chase Lochmiller from Crusoe Energy. We have Margot Paez, BPI Institute Fellow. And Matt Lostra from Giga Energy. All right, y'all. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Excited for this.
Howdy.
Yeah. Before we get started and get rumbling on our favorite topic, would love to just kind of give the audience an opportunity to know a little bit about everybody's background. Chase, we can start with you and kind of make our way back.
Cool. I'm Chase Lochmiller. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Crusoe Energy. Crusoe is focused on unlocking value in stranded energy resources with computing. Bitcoin mining is a big component of those computing applications that we deploy into stranded energy resources like flared gas and curtailed renewables.
Very cool. Awesome.
Cool. Hi, I'm Margot. I'm a fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, and I'm also a PhD candidate at Georgia Tech. I do research on Bitcoin at the intersection of the energy and environment, and do some policy work, and really excited to be here. Thank you.
Howdy, Matt Lostra, co-founder and CEO of Giga Energy. We manufacture natural gas generators and Bitcoin mining data centers to lower the cost of mitigating methane in the oil field from a flare standpoint, as well as being a power infrastructure provider for normal Bitcoin miners in the industry.
Great. And a little bit on me, I'm Margot Gutierrez. I am a geoscientist with a background in upstream technologies. Was at ExxonMobil when I saw the Crusoe pilots and projects kind of kicking off over there, and it's I think amazing to see what's been able to happen in the industry since 3-4 years ago. Entered the industry through Vibe Energy and currently run corporate strategy at AEXA Digital Infrastructure, which builds field scale solutions leveraging proof of work for the oil and gas sector. With that to kick off, guys, I think we've mentioned flare a couple times in our introductions. I think that's the case study that we best know when it comes to Bitcoin mining and stranded energy. And from an educational perspective, we're going to kind of go from what is stranded energy, why does Bitcoin really work so well with stranded energy, how is it being done right now, and then what's tomorrow's solutions going to look like. And so with that being said, Chase, I'd be interested if we could kind of share with the audience why is proof of work such a good partner for associated gas in the oil field.
Sure. I think it's worth starting just by discussing what flaring is and sort of why it happens. So flaring happens in the oil field when associated gas produced alongside oil has no economic means to get to a market where it can actually be sold because there's no access to a pipeline or there's no mechanism to economically build a pipeline and connect that gas into a market. And so oftentimes when you're in this situation, the best and most economic thing to do is to just light it on fire on location. Right. And that's problematic for a couple of reasons. One, you're burning a natural resource with no beneficial use. Two, actually a lot of the methane escapes uncombusted from the flare. About 9% of the methane escapes uncombusted. And that's problematic because methane traps 84 times more heat in the atmosphere than CO2. So from a greenhouse gas perspective, it creates a massive problem. So when you think about this problem of flaring, I think why Bitcoin mining is very unique and a great solution to unlocking value from this otherwise stranded and flared gas is that Bitcoin mining is global, decentralized, and permissionless in nature, which means you don't need anyone's permission to sort of participate in the network. You can just sort of set up your own servers and start validating and running hash rate to validate and secure transactions. And the other big aspects are Bitcoin mining is a pretty low bandwidth computing application. So oftentimes the flares are in very remote areas that may have limited network connection. And Bitcoin mining is great because it can harness into cell networks, satellite networks, sort of any sort of connectivity. It doesn't need a lot of bandwidth, and it can run on site with the flaring.
Would you guys agree it's much more of a text message than it is Netflix from a bandwidth perspective, right? As a
Exactly.
Simple.
Exactly.
Very cool. Awesome. And Matt, you're down a couple hours away from the energy capital of the world. As Chase mentioned, the flare mitigation solution I think is something that most of this room can agree with. What other aspects of the conversation when you talk to producers do you present them in addition to being able to mitigate the flare?
Well, it's very expensive and takes a long time to get this infrastructure in place. And so when looking at it, we're saying, hey, how can we lower the cost for everyone to be doing this and being able to do it on very quickly time scale? One thing that's kind of important to know about these flares is they often decrease in their volume very quickly. It's called a decline curve. And so coming in and saying, hey, how can we get the economics around it to the point that we can monetize this energy economically and have payback on a project?
Very cool. Excellent. And so, flare, I think, in the oil field is one of these great examples that we've been able to really kind of study. But there's, methane within itself is, a problem or an opportunity across, different types of assets. And Margot, I know that, we've spoken on, one of the other large flare sources that's stranded is landfills, right? And how are, for example, Bitcoin miners thinking about landfills versus going out 4 hours away in North Dakota or West Texas to tackle oil flare?
Yeah. So, hold on. Let me see if I understand your question. Like, what are you asking in terms of the difference?
What are some of the differences, right?
Yeah. So, well, these landfill sites, I mean, they're also in municipal areas. They're not necessarily that far away from the interconnection sites, but it really depends. I think they might. I mean, I'm not that familiar with the oil and gas industry, so I may be making false comparisons, so you guys can let me know. But I think it might be a little different depending on the different regions across the country. So, like, for example, there's quite a lot of landfills in municipal areas in California. In other parts of the country, they may be further out, but my understanding is that there's also a number that are close to highways, which expands the opportunities of what you could do with a mining operation or an energy operation if you're thinking long-term along the lines of the energy transition and utilizing that stranded energy for building out infrastructure like having distributed EV sites, like EV power charging sites, for example. So there may be different constraints there from the oil and gas, or different opportunities just because of the locations where they're based.
For sure. Awesome. I really appreciate that. And one of the questions that I think we all tend to kind of get into, perhaps after a couple drinks here in Miami, is what's the difference between stranded energy and what's the difference between wasted energy? And if energy is stranded, is it stranded due to infrastructure such as stranded flare? There's no legacy market for it. Is it perhaps operationally stranded? Or is it socially stranded as well? And so, kind of, I'll open it up to the panel. Do you think there's an actual difference, or what's is there any thoughts around energy that's wasted and energy that's really stranded?
Yeah. So I mean, this is kind of natural gas Bitcoin mining, right? It's this cool, sexy thing. It's good for the environment, and that's often what's signaled online. What people don't realize, what's often going in the background, is just because something's running off natural gas doesn't mean it's reducing carbon emissions. And what is kind of happening often is you have natural gas that is uneconomical. And so locationally, you can have different pricing with natural gas all throughout the U.S., particularly in regions where you have a lot of supply and not enough demand based on pipeline capacities. And so what some people are doing are going in, taking that natural gas that is just really cheap, but it could still, eventually be supplied to the grid, and then using their operations to run off of that. And, it's just a energy arbitrage at that point. But I think one of the things that's kind of, a little bit deceiving online is people are seeing natural gas Bitcoin mining as, always good, and based on some people's definitions, little deceiving in my opinion.
Yeah, I think also, I think there are some differences between stranded and wasted energy. Like, the renewable energy industry has a lot of wasted energy in the sense that they're generally interconnected. You can sell to the grid, but there are times when you can't sell or there aren't off-takers, so you're not able to take advantage of, let's say, the full gamut of tax credits. You can't, you're not able to meet certain revenue thresholds, or maybe you modeled out like, you were going to have this much uptime or you're going to have this much offtake, and then the grid operator says, no, actually, you're going to have to curtail like 10% more. So I think that's maybe a little bit of a different scenario there, but it's also something that Bitcoin miners can help with, provide a revenue floor there.
Cool. Any thoughts, Chase?
Yeah, I thought Matt did a really nice job sort of giving a summary there. It is a bit nuanced, but globally there's about 14.5 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas that get flared associated with oil production. It's enough to power the Bitcoin network 8 times over. So it's a massive amount of wasted energy.
Yeah.
That's energy that's being wasted. But I think one of the things Matt was sort of alluding to is there's a lot of natural gas that's just in the ground.
That would otherwise stay there.
That would otherwise stay there, exactly. So that gas that's being flared today, that's associated gas that's being produced alongside oil. There's also gas wells. The geology of the of the area will determine kind of the gas to oil ratio. And there are natural gas wells that maybe aren't being produced because gas prices are too low,
right,
or because the pipeline hasn't been built out yet. If you operate those wells to basically mine Bitcoin, it's a net like additive demand for gas that would otherwise stay in the ground, not be flared. So it is a bit nuanced, but I thought you did a great job.
And there's one other energy source that's stranded, and that's geothermal. And you said wells, and that reminded me, you can then use these wells where they're not productive anymore, and then you can use them for getting to that geothermal energy. And that's also something that Bitcoin miners are able to, or can be able to make use of and monetize that build out of that infrastructure as well. So I think that's something we might see in the near future.
No, definitely, yeah. It's geothermal, I think, is that dream, at least from a geologist perspective, that checks all the boxes in many regards. There's geothermal. Just kind of before we transition to how we work, Bitcoin miners work with these companies, and some of the challenges. What are some, let's say, a little bit more out there stranded energy opportunities that you guys are aware of, or that interest you, beyond the methane mitigation story or stranded renewables?
So I guess I'll start by saying, I think there's sometimes people criticize the Bitcoin network for consuming lots of energy,
right,
because energy usage is somehow conflated with being a bad thing. I think it's actually a really important aspect to the network and its overall defensibility, because it requires a lot of energy to attack the network. And for those of us that have entrusted Bitcoin as a effective store of value, having that defensibility of a high barrier to attack, I think is really, really important. But I think the other aspect is that energy production and usage is like the number one component to a productive society. And I think people's mentality should be not the scarcity mindset that we need to use less, but we need to be more efficient with how we use our existing resources and figure out ways to more efficiently produce more energy and more power.
Right.
But to your question earlier about other forms of stranded energy, there's a lot of I've seen things as crazy as trying to harness wave energy in the middle of the ocean that may have a very, very low uptime, but it's a very, very low overall cost of production. That's one of the other aspects about Bitcoin mining is it's an interruptible computing workload in ways that almost nothing else in the computing space is, which makes it fit very well with stranded energy resources that can't necessarily deliver consistent 100% reliable uptime. And I think that's one of the other aspects that makes it work very, very well with flare gas. There's also, I mean, people are building solar farms to capture tax credits, and they're not even connected into the grid. So they're literally just, in the middle of nowhere, producing power, and that power is going nowhere. But there's all sorts of like market nuances and inefficiencies that Bitcoin can actually be a mechanism to help monetize that otherwise wasted energy resources.
No, that's I really appreciate that. It's when people say, "Oh, Bitcoin uses more energy than Argentina," I'm just like, "Well, we need to just use more energy in Argentina in general." Right? And I'm sure we'll get to Argentina later in this conversation. But one of the things I think the audience might be able to appreciate is, when you say the word stranded, you think this is far away, right? Which means this is probably not easy, right? Or else everybody would be doing it. Outside of just plugging in the ASIC, Matt, I would love to hear you guys building your shop in east of Houston, down in South Texas. What are some of the challenges or the learnings that you've had in deploying your solutions in the oil field?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just cost and time. Coming down to how can we, economically monetize this stranded gas on a pretty efficient basis. So we have about 20,000 square feet of manufacturing over in Houston, Texas, just east of there. We go in, we take used generators that are otherwise kind of, sitting in junkyards, rebuild them back up, about 255 moving parts, rebuild them back from the ground up, put in brand new equipment like brand new radiators, brand new generator ends that are specifically for Bitcoin mining, 415 to 240, so you don't need a transformer on site. And so there's just kind of little efficiencies that when you think of something from a Bitcoin mining perspective, you say, how can I max this thing out on an engineering basis? And that's not how engineers in the real world work. They think of how can we put in 3x of safety factors. And so we're saying, how can we run this thing to the limits? And at the same time, reduce cost by about 50%. And then again, we try and make it really sexy, packaged up, and very simplistic so that you have a wonderful user experience for whoever's in the oil field. We have people of all ages mining Bitcoin on natural gas coming in. You got old mom and pop producers, 80 years old, saying like, let me rig this thing together and get some Bitcoins. They don't even know what it is, but they realize that they can make money, and that's the economic incentive that drives them. And then on the other side of it, we manufacture the Bitcoin mining data centers just for any traditional load services.
Cool. And I can imagine a power generator in the oil field isn't just going to be humming, perfectly the whole time. Chase, you guys have a large presence in the Williston Basin up in North Dakota. I can imagine the winters are a challenge. What are some of the trade-offs between having a large centralized facility versus having a distributed footprint of compute?
No, it's a great point. Flare gas-based mining is definitely much more operationally complex than a lot of the larger grid-connected facilities. It's also more widely dispersed. So we have sites ranging from 2 megawatts to 30 megawatts at a individual location, and we try to cover a geographic area. And in order to make that all work from a staffing perspective, we've built up a high-performance team of mechanics and technicians and electricians that sort of manage the individual locations, and it's quite a bit of work, but I think it's because grid-connected Bitcoin miners, like they're not the power company. When you're off grid, you're sort of responsible for producing your own power, and which means you gotta take care of, maintain all of the power generation and electrical equipment yourself.
Very cool. Perhaps kind of zooming out from what we see in the States and kind of turning our heads internationally. There's been several announcements about stranded energy developments with Bitcoin happening in what you would call in the developing markets, whether you have gridless in Africa bringing electricity to communities and co-locating, to Bhutan, the country of Bhutan announcing that they're going to harness their hydropower. Margot, is there, kind of looking outside, what gets you excited in regards to Bitcoin mining and stranded energy in some of these markets that have so much potential, and we're just starting to kind of get into the first inning of developing those opportunities?
Yeah, I think those stories are really fantastic because it solves two problems to be able to do that. Like, one, there is this issue of energy poverty in a lot of these countries, but also they have an abundance of hydropower that is underutilized. So the ability to access that hydropower, monetize it, build out the infrastructure, so that you can build out the grid and then connect people, raise their living, their standard of living, but also do it in a way that is in line with all of our goals around the climate mitigation, the Paris climate goals, all of that. That's hard to do. And one of the arguments against decarbonization goals is that you're basically going to impoverish these people, starve them because you're telling them, no, you can't use oil and gas. But they actually have so much hydropower that isn't being used that they can utilize that as a base load and also bring in other technologies or because you will need some natural gas in these regions as well. But the fact that you can do it in a low carbon way and bring up the living standard and keep in line with all those mitigation goals, I think is really exciting. And the fact that you can do it with Bitcoin in a way that you couldn't do before is also an example of how special it is in this regard because of all of its unique properties being location agnostic. The uptimes, you can ramp up and down very easily. Connecting to network or disconnecting from the network doesn't affect the security of the network. It doesn't affect the processes of running through all the calculations in order to win that block reward, right? That block reward. Those blocks get added approximately every 10 minutes, right? So that's really, really important. That's a really important part of what makes Bitcoin mining so unique. So I think that's really exciting. Just in terms of the whole climate perspective and the fact that we have to now be really mindful of the kinds of energy sources that we're using as we do this energy transition. Yeah.
Right, and it's one of it's a very complex question, right? You go to Houston, you go to people who've been studying energy for generations, and it's how can we solve problems and be efficient on emissions while making sure that people still have access to all the base needs that they have, right? And I think we can all agree that Bitcoin is a tool to really optimize and solve those solutions. You see announcements from South Africa last year where in efforts to meet climate goals, they're now having even worse rolling blackouts. At the same time, you have I think it's 90% of the flare in the world it's just being just put out there with no real regard, right? So there's, no matter how you want to kind of approach the problem, I think everybody can agree that doing things better is definitely, kind of the thing to focus on. Kind of facing internationally, Matt and Chase, dealing with a private firm in the United States to work on flare projects is a much different dance than talking about, megawatts worth of flare with national oil companies internationally. When you guys approach your stakeholders internationally, what are some of the conversations you have, and how are they different from going out to East Texas or hanging out in the Rockies?
Yeah. So currently we're expanding into one country. We've publicly announced into Argentina in the Vaca Muerta Basin. We have a couple conversations going on with other people that we haven't announced yet, but the incentives of a private entity versus a public entity are very different. The term of the contracts, the type of the wells, the volume that you're talking about is completely different. And they just have different incentives. And so when you look at someone in a public office that has a national oil company, they're not necessarily thinking of how do they make money. They're saying, how can we stay in office? How can we paint this picture to be beneficial for our administration? And it's just a very different term of contract. And so it's, I wouldn't say it's better, it's different, but it's something that is definitely very unique, and you kind of start removing market efficiencies and getting into many different nuances in conversations with them.
Yeah, so just on the flare mitigation side of things, I think it's first important to recognize that flaring really is a global problem. It happens everywhere we produce oil. So while it's sort of been popularized in the U.S., the U.S. only accounts for about 10% of the global flaring footprint. The other 90% happens everywhere else in the world. And so, I think in our experience, a couple of the areas that we've been focused on expanding, like in the Middle East, for instance, you have a country like Oman. And what's interesting about Oman is the World Bank created this pledge to end routine flaring by 2030 that was signed on to by a number of the large international oil companies as well as certain nations. So not only did Oman, the country, sign on to the pledge, but the biggest national oil company there, PDO, also signed on to that pledge. The issue they're facing is that they don't really have solutions. There's not, Oman's a fairly small country, and it's the 10th largest flaring country in the world. Yeah. I think it's about 4 million people that live there. It's a kind of a crazy dynamic where the people want to solve this problem. The government's sort of committed to solving this problem, but they don't have nobody wants to lose a bunch of money to sort of fix this problem. Sure. And I think that's one of the really cool applications of Bitcoin is that you can actually, for the first time ever, have a highly flexible and economic solution to mitigating flaring in some of the most challenging regions because of a lot of the properties of Bitcoin mining that we've discussed earlier today.
Yeah.
Somewhat of an economic carrot instead of a stick, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. That's really important because in the context of our climate goals, again, with methane mitigation, because the climate scientists are starting to realize that methane is playing a much bigger role in terms of the warming, and methane has like a 25 times greater intensity of warming over 100 years, or like 84 times over 20 years. So it's a really significant component. It could be up to half of the already warming that we are experiencing. And outside of countries like the U.S., where we have stronger regulations or more government stability, it's harder to incentivize that capture of methane. So to be able to do it economically really solves a really big problem of reducing those methane emissions. So what these guys are doing outside of the U.S., it may even be more important than what they're doing in the U.S. within that global context. And so it really can't be understated that we have to reduce those methane emissions, and the oil and gas is a really big component of the humans, derived emissions that we see today.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. Is like Chase said, 10% of the emissions are in the U.S., 90% are outside of the U.S., majority of those in developing countries, because flaring is based around infrastructure. Infrastructure is based on capital allocation, and developing countries just don't have a lot of capital. And they don't have EPAs, and that's usually where the footprint is far more heavily felt. There's lack of regulations. You have this stuff going on around indigenous people, and just Wild West out there. And I mean, that's where you can really have a much greater impact, not just on the environment, but also on human lives.
So in addition to Bitcoin adoption being really realized in developing markets where currencies are failing, you could say that innovations around mining and stranded energy are also on the forefront internationally as well. One of the things I think is also I'd love to kind of hear your takes on are on the policy side. Margot, that's where I think you definitely have done a great effort in kind of educating a lot of people. See, Chase, I'm sure, and Matt, you guys internationally have to kind of have the conversations with not just the oil operator but other stakeholders. What are some of the concerns when you bring this almost this revolutionary technology to them, and they kind of almost don't believe that what do you mean you want to just reduce the flare or help us monetize stranded hydro that can electrify the community? What are some initial reactions you get from those types of stakeholders?
Well, I mean, I have not followed on the state level, so I don't know what the state level reactions are. But on the national level, obviously the reactions are generally informed by the environmental organizations. It's particularly partisan, so a lot of the Democrats are opposed. And some of the big concerns I think that come up, which I think is probably important to try to answer, is from their perspective is monetizing any kind of stranded natural gas could lead to more profits for the oil and gas industry. So for them, they see that as a bad thing, like the environmentalists who are lobbying the Democrats, and they think that you should not be increasing the profits of the oil and gas industry. You should be decreasing. You should be putting them out of business. So I think that's one of the criticisms that comes up a lot. Another criticism is, of course, on the emissions side, in the sense that, well, okay, you're combusting that gas, and so you still have CO2 emissions, but when you look at the global warming potential, at least I can answer that one, the global warming potential of that which means like what's the impact of methane versus carbon dioxide, the dangers of just allowing that methane to vent versus combusting it, converting it to CO2 and having that CO2 go into the atmosphere is pretty big. Like, it's much better to combust it and let it be CO2. You're not going to have as much of a warming impact. And so I think that's just maybe like a misunderstanding of how the emissions are, how they work, and how they're quantified.
Right.
So I think those are probably the main ones in terms of like using the flared or vented gas that I've heard.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it's just an education, just educating people. And, I think if you look at the problem of flaring, just, not to hammer it again, but, this is something that globally, like not only is it wasteful, like we're not getting any benefit from it, but globally it accounts for 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So, this is a really, really meaningful total component, or component of our total impact. And I think if you approached anyone and you said, hey, I have this solution. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I can, without any subsidies, I can economically mitigate all of the flaring around the world. I think every policymaker and regulator, in and around the oil and gas industry would be like, what is it? This is amazing. Like, how do we roll this out and, get to zero routine flaring? But, I think once Bitcoin can be a bit of a triggering word, but I think, a lot of it is just about educating people about, the emissions and sort of the impact you can have on a positive front. Last week, Crusoe actually published our first ever sustainability report that had, independently audited data around our total emissions footprint as a company. So, from that, we helped reduce over 500,000 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions last year. And, when you add up all of the emissions of our company, which is, our fleets of trucks, our, office buildings, our, me flying down here to Miami, we actually reduced 60% more emissions than we created as a company. So we were actually like a net negative emissions company, which is something that we were, very, very proud of. But I think it also sort of puts something out there that, people can sort of look at and be like, hey, this technology isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's actually, can be a net positive in terms of advancing society's climate goals.
Very cool. We have 5 minutes left, and I've really appreciated your guys' insights on flare mitigation, stranded renewables, and kind of coming back to the core question of where's the stranded energy, and kind of looking forward. I think we all have kind of a pretty defined roadmap of the blocking and tackling in that regard. But at the end of the day, Bitcoin miners are looking for the cheapest source of energy. And, I'd love to have your thoughts on, not only can something be operationally stranded, but you might be socially stranded. And so, if you are a coal producer in Wyoming who can't sell their power because California or their surrounding states won't buy coal-generated power, or you are an oil producer in the Permian Basin who is limited by your gas offtake and needs to meet their liquids goals for quarterly targets, those might present opportunities where those sources of energy might be even more competitive than behind-the-meter solar or flare. And so, do you think that socially stranded types of energy may start to have the growth, or do you think that's something that Bitcoin miners are going to willingly not be the most competitive participant and not touch those sources?
I mean, name of the game is Bitcoin miners have cheapest cost of energy. How you achieve that, whether it's having a really low power bill or having subsidies, is up to you. Long term, to be really, really competitive and have large margins, is figuring out second derivatives of revenue, whether that be subsidies, whether that be impacts on your operation. You now have a greenhouse farm attached to your Bitcoin mining, right? Whatever that may be, it has to go that route. I think particularly as it relates to flare gas mining, the 25x multiplier associated with methane is what really allows for significant second derivative revenues. So I think that's going to be something that really makes it stick out in the long run. Not to say other stuff won't, and the economics are going to choose the winner.
Any thoughts?
Well, I'm pretty biased against coal, so I would love to see Bitcoin be involved in converting those plants into something a little more, less carbon intensive. I think that would be very cool. I also think there was one, stranded energy we really didn't touch on, which is the waste heat that comes out of the Bitcoin miners themselves. Yeah. And I think that's a really important, and also, an additional revenue stream for the mining operations too. So capturing that can also offset other fossil fuel sources for heating, and I think that's also a really cool way to utilize Bitcoin miners themselves to reduce emissions. So that's my take.
So you're telling me we can have fresh avocados in North America in the winter, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the goal for all of us here.
Yeah. Heat up those jacuzzis,
Yeah, excellent.
Distill that whiskey.
Yeah. Chase, looking forward, in regards to co-development or opportunities, do you have any kind of last thoughts?
In terms of what opportunities?
Of developing stranded energy, or business models that perhaps we haven't seen yet.
Yeah. So, I mean, to your earlier question, I think right now you're sort of getting this alignment between global climate policy goals and actually economics, and the stranded and wasted energy resources tend to be the cleanest as well. So mitigating waste methane, today that methane has a value of 0, right? And if your primary product is something else, even if it's socially stranded, it's never going to be able to compete with sort of this monetizing this associated byproduct. Similarly, in kind of the renewable space, for a lot of renewable energy production, you sort of have these moments of off-peak where there's no marginal buyer for sort of the electrons that are being produced, because the sun is shining, not necessarily always when people are demanding power, and so I think there's a lot of alignment just around what's good for the climate and what's good for Bitcoin miners to seek out the lowest cost power. And I think there's also some great incentives that are sort of coming about, things like the Sustainable Bitcoin Protocol, which is actually sort of a certificate that demonstrates, for institutional investors that are interested in holding Bitcoin but want it in sort of a provably clean capacity, that the energy that went into mining the Bitcoin was sort of provably clean. It's sort of society paying people to do things in a more climate-aligned capacity, and you have other things like carbon credits, which I think is all kind of pushing us in the right direction.
Great, excellent. Well, guys, this has been an absolute pleasure. It's, we've had this conversations 2 years ago. I think things have really kind of, evolved amazingly since then. And I really appreciate time, and I hope we can have a similar conversation on how's the stranded energy doing in a couple of years, and really be able to show how Bitcoin mining is really kind of revolutionizing that subject. So please, everybody, give a round of applause to our panelists.
Thank you, Miami, for the last 3 years in this amazing city. The whole world shut down, but Miami welcomed us with open arms. We want to show Bitcoin to the whole world. We are taking the conference on the road to set the stage for Bitcoin in a new city. Nashville. Bitcoin 2024 is coming to Nashville in Tennessee, a city that is known as a music and freedom city. Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville from July 25th to 27th.